Now on Overnights,
I believe in reason and common sense.
Leith Van Onselen from Macro Business with the Treasury of Common Sense.
Common sense never goes out of style.
Certainly doesn't with this man, Leith Van Onselen. Morning, mate. How are you?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Phil. How about yourself?
I'm okay, but I'm part of the rental crisis. What's the solution?
Yeah, mate. Look. Unfortunately, the solution's staring us in the face, but no politician or the media, or most of the media, I should say, or the property industry wants to accept what is staring us right in the face. So, just to give a bit of background, the Australian Financial Review held their property summit last week, and it included a whole bunch of property industry players and the housing minister and then the federal housing minister Claire O'Neill, the New South Wales planning minister Paul Scully, a whole bunch of people, and they all harped on about the usual bluster about the need to lift Australia's housing supply to meet demand. It's all a supply issue, supply, all the usual stuff. So we had New South Wales planning minister Paul Scully. He accused anti-development residents in wealthy suburbs of being NIMBYs and trying to lock future generations out of housing. You had Mike Zorbas, who's the Chief Executive of the Property Council of Australia. He also heaped praise on the government for facing off against NIMBYs. You had a developer, Nigel Slattery, who called for more skilled migrants to work in construction to boost, housing construction, ignoring the fact that immigration's already at historic highs, some of the highest levels in history. And as usual, Phil, there was absolutely no mention, no acknowledgement that the fundamental reason why Australia has a housing shortage is because it's run excessive immigration policy for 20 years. So Australia's population's ballooned by about 8.7 million people this century, which is a 46% increase since the turn of the century.
Right.
That's the fastest growth in the advanced world. And a respected chief economist, Shane Oliver, chief economist at AMP, he recently estimated that Australia has a cumulative housing shortage of between 200 and 300,000 homes.
Yeah.
And he blamed this shortage on excessive levels of immigration since 2005, which is when they ramped it up. And he said that immigration's been above the nation's capacity to build housing and infrastructure. And the federal government's own National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, so that's the government's own advisor on housing supply and affordability, they released their State of the Housing Market report a few months back. And they projected that the nation's housing shortage is going to increase by another 79,000 over the next 5 years as Australia's population growth through immigration continues to outrun our ability to build housing, right? So we're already at 200 to 300,000 shortage, and the federal government's own advisory council said we're going to have another 79,000 on top of that over the next 5 years because population growth is going to be stronger than new housing supply. So as a result, Australia's housing shortage and rental crisis are going to continue to worsen so long as the federal government persists in running this excessively high immigration policy. Now, we know that Australian renters are suffering. Like Phil, you mentioned that you're a renter, so your rents have probably gone up heaps, and you're feeling it like everyone else.
Yeah.
Now, Cotality, they used to be called CoreLogic. They're one of the main private sector housing data providers in the country. They estimated that at the end of last year, rental payments were chewing up a record share of household income. So they forecast that they estimate that 33% of the typical household's income was going in rents. And Cotality, in their June quarter rental review that was just released recently, estimated that weekly rents nationally have risen by $200 per week since the start of the pandemic. That's a 43% increase over the past 5 years. And as a result, the typical renter in Australia is now paying an extra $10,350 per year to rent a typical home.
Wow!
So that's an enormous increase. Can you imagine that if you're a renter and you're paying over $10,000 more per year to rent a house than you were at the start of the pandemic? That's a massive squeeze in your disposable income and on your quality of life, right? That's money that you've got to make up somewhere else and you can't spend on other things. And obviously, the driver of this surge in rents has been the post-pandemic surge in immigration. So, over the 36 months between when the Albanese government was elected in June 2022 and the end of last year, that's the latest data we've got on the official migration numbers, we've had 1.1 million net migrants land in Australia over that 36-month period. So that's 2.5 years. That is an enormous amount. And obviously, logically, this surge in immigration has led to high demand in the rental market, right? People come in, they've got to live somewhere. And as a result, rental vacancy rates across the country have fallen to record lows. And as a result, we've had this huge 43% increase in rents over the past 5 years. You know, none of this is rocket science. When the borders were shut at the start of the pandemic, rents fell. When borders reopened and we had record surge in immigration, rents soared, right? Now, there's this private company called CBRE, which does analysis on the apartment market and things like that. They released their apartment vacancy rent and outlook report this week, and it forecasts that Australia's population demand, much like the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council forecast, they forecast that population demand is going to continue to exceed supply over the coming years, and as a result, the national capital city vacancy rate, according to the CBRE, is going to fall to a record low of 1.1% by 2030. So that's in 5 years' time, down from 1.8% currently, which is already close to a record low. So it's going to get even worse. So the rental market in the next 5 years is going to tighten even worse. And as a result, CBRE forecasts that 92% of two-bedroom apartments across Australia's capital cities are going to have rents exceeding $700 per week by 2030. So they're going to rise significantly. So in other words, Phil, the upshot of this is that Australian renters are facing more pain as the rental crisis is just going to continue as demand through population growth, i.e. immigration, continues to exceed supply, right? That's what the Federal Government's Advisory Council, National Housing Supply and Affordability Council says. That's what CBRE says. Now, here's the rub, Phil. The solution's pretty obvious, right? I've already alluded to it, but we actually have a case study that's been played out overseas in Canada, right? So while Australia's property industry, politicians and media continue to blame a lack of supply, they all say it's a supply crisis for Australia's rental crisis. Canada provides the template and the solution of what to do, and they're doing it right now. It's to cut immigration. So, like in Australia, rents in Canada soared to record highs in 2022 and 2023 in response to a massive immigration surge. So Canada, like Australia, had the biggest immigration surge in its history when its borders reopened after the pandemic, and its rents went through the roof. But last year, unlike our government, the Canadian government imposed a 3-year population freeze. So they basically said they're going to freeze the population for 3 years, have zero population growth, in order to relieve strains on housing and infrastructure and all those sort of things, which have gotten out of control. And the plans work, Phil, because lots of temporary migrants have left Canada, and Canada's net migration has decreased by more than 90% from what it was at its peak. Like, population growth's almost at zero now in Canada. And this sharp decline in immigration and population growth has actually led to 11 consecutive months, I should say, of falling rents. So rents are now falling across Canada, and they've actually fallen in Vancouver and Toronto, which are two main cities there, the most. And Vancouver and Toronto, surprise, surprise, are also the cities that have experienced the biggest declines in population growth. So you don't have to be rocket science here. Canada experienced exactly the same rental crisis as us when immigration surged. Like us, it's ran a huge immigration program, except unlike us in Australia, the government has said we're going to freeze population growth. We're going to actually have a period of negative net migration. It's already begun. They've been running this policy for about 9 months. And as a result, we've had 11 consecutive months of falling rents in Canada. Well, it's actually been running for about a year.
Right.
To the start of mid last year. So they cut immigration, population growth basically goes to zero. Rents fall for 11 consecutive months, right? So the rental market's becoming more affordable there. The two cities that experienced the biggest decline in population growth, which is Vancouver and Toronto, have also experienced the biggest decline in rents. Not rocket science here. And Canada's largest bank, which is BMO, which is like, that's like their CBA, I should say, because that's our largest bank. They stated last month that they forecast that rents will continue to fall as, quote, stricter immigration targets continue to slow population growth and limit new household formations. And BMO also noted that immigration has transformed from a tailwind to a headwind for the housing market. So here's the solution. We've got a rental crisis, cut immigration. Pretty obvious stuff. And here's the other rub, Bill. The National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, the government's own advisory, the Australian government's own advisory council, in their sensitivity analysis to that report I mentioned earlier, they said that if Australia's population grows by just 15% less than what the federal government forecasts, instead of having a 79,000 shortfall of housing, in the next 5 years, we'll have a surplus of 40,000 homes, right? So if we just grow the population by 15% less than what the government forecasts, which is still strong growth, instead of having 79,000 worsening in Australia's housing shortage, we'll have a 40,000 surplus of homes in the next 5 years. So the solution there, according to the federal government's own advisory council, is if you want to solve the rental crisis, you want to actually alleviate the housing shortage, cut immigration. It's literally stated in black and white by the government's own advisory council. Canada is doing this overseas, and its rental crisis is evaporating. It's no longer been a crisis. It's gone from being a crisis into no longer being a crisis because it's had 11 consecutive months of rents coming down and making rents more affordable. So here's the question, Phil. What the hell is the Australian government doing here? Why are we pretending that this is a supply issue at the same time as the federal government runs one of the biggest migration policies in Australia's history? Like net overseas migration, the last official figures we got was December quarter last year. We had 340,000 net overseas migration. Yes, that's down from the peak of the year before. But the thing about it, Phil, is it's still higher than anything in Australia's history before the pandemic.
That's it.
Right? So we're still running absurdly high immigration. We cannot build enough housing to keep up. We cannot build enough infrastructure. And as a result, we've got a housing crisis when the solution is bloody obvious. Just cut it. Just like Canada has. Just like the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council's own sensitivity analysis says to do. It's as simple as that, Phil.
Where can people find more information on your website if they want to do some reading here?
Yes. Thanks, Phil. They can go to macrobusiness.com.au.